The scrolls were burned, the witnesses silenced, and for 2,000 years, the story you were told became the only story allowed to survive. But what if I told you there's another version, one written in whispers, in margins, in texts that were hidden not because they were lies, but because they were dangerous truths? If history is written by the victors, what happened to the voices of those who lost? Long before the world knew his name, before empires rose in his honor and cathedrals pierced the sky, there was a man, a Jewish man, born in Galilee, raised under Roman occupation, and according to some of the oldest, most suppressed documents in existence, he was not what you've been taught. The story begins not in Bethlehem, but in the rabbinical courts of Jerusalem, in texts so controversial, so inflammatory, that even speaking their names was punishable by death. These were not the writings of enemies. These were Jewish records, written by those who knew him, who watched him, who stood trial against him. And what they recorded was not divinity, it was accusation. There is a book, ancient, fragmented, passed down in secret among Jewish communities for nearly 2 millennia. It was never meant for Christian eyes. In fact, for centuries, owning it could cost you your life. The church called it blasphemy. Scholars called it folklore. But those who read it called it something else, the truth they tried to erase. Its name is Toledot Yeshu, the life of Jesus, and in its pages the man you call Savior is called something very different. Sorcerer, deceiver, a student who stole the forbidden name of God and used it to perform wonders that were never his to command. According to these texts, he did not learn his miracles from heaven. He learned them in Egypt, in the temples of the old gods, in the secret chambers where magic and mysticism were still practiced long after Moses led his people out. The texts claim he inscribed the Shem HaMepharash, the ineffable name of God, onto his own flesh, and with it he bent the natural world to his will, not through holiness, through theft. The rabbis of the Talmud do not deny his existence. They do not dismiss his works, but they do reframe them. In Sanhedrin 43a, it is written that Yeshu was hanged on the eve of Passover for practicing sorcery and leading Israel astray. Hanged, not crucified for salvation, but executed for heresy. And there's more. In Sanhedrin 107b, he's described as a student of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Parachia, expelled for arrogance and immorality. The text claims he worshipped a brick, that he mocked the teachers, that he was cast out and turned to dark practices in retaliation. These are not fringe writings. These are passages found in the Babylonian Talmud, one of the most sacred texts in Judaism. And for centuries, Christians demanded they be censored. In medieval Europe, entire editions of the Talmud were burned specifically because they contained references to Jesus that contradicted the gospel narrative. Why burn a book unless it threatens the foundation of your faith? But the rabbinical texts were not alone. There were others. The Sefer Toledot Yeshu circulated in multiple versions across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Some said his father was a Roman soldier named Pantera. Others claimed his mother was accused of adultery. All agreed on one thing: he was not born of a virgin. He was born of scandal. And when he grew, he did not preach love and redemption. He preached rebellion. He gathered followers not through divine authority, but through spectacle, through signs that dazzled the uneducated and infuriated the learned. The texts describe him as a magician who used tricks and stolen knowledge to deceive the masses. In one version, the Sanhedrin confronts him. They demand proof of his divinity. He calls upon the name of God, rises into the air, and declares himself the Messiah. But then, a sage named Judah also speaks the name. He rises as well, and in midair, the two do battle. Magic against magic, name against name. Judah wins. Yeshu falls, and he is arrested, tried, and condemned. not as a martyr, as a criminal. This is not the story you were told in Sunday school. This is the story that was told in synagogues, in hushed voices, when Christians were not listening. The story that survived persecution, inquisition, and censorship. The story that some believe was not propaganda, but memory. And here is where it gets even darker, because the texts do not end with his death. They continue. They describe what happened after, how his followers stole his body, how they spread rumors of resurrection, how a new religion was born, not from truth, but from deception. According to Toledot Yeshu, the disciples knew he was not divine, but they also knew that his death could be used, turned into myth, into movement, and so they hid his corpse and claimed he had risen. They preached in his name. And within decades, the message spread across the Roman world like wildfire, not because it was true, but because it was powerful. The Romans eventually adopted it. Constantine made it law, and within 3 centuries, the religion of a Jewish heretic had become the official faith of the empire that killed him. But the Jews did not forget. They kept their records, their warnings, their version of events, and they passed them down in secret generation after generation, knowing that one day someone would ask the question that changes everything. What if the greatest story ever told was not the only story ever written? The church knew about these texts. They always knew. In 1239, Pope Gregory IX ordered the confiscation of every copy of the Talmud in Christian Europe. Thousands of manuscripts were seized from synagogues, from homes, from scholars who had spent their lives preserving them. In Paris alone, 24 cartloads of Jewish books were burned in a single day. The smoke rose over the city like a funeral pyre for knowledge itself. But it wasn't random destruction. It was targeted. Specific passages were cited as evidence of blasphemy, passages that mentioned Yeshu, passages that contradicted the virgin birth, passages that called him a sorcerer instead of a savior. The church didn't just want to suppress these texts. They wanted to erase the fact that they had ever existed. And yet, they survived. Because the Jewish people did something extraordinary. They memorized them. When the books were burned, the words lived on in the minds of rabbis and scribes who recited them in secret. When the Inquisition came, they hid fragments in false walls, in coded letters, in oral traditions passed from teacher to student in whispers. They knew that if the truth was lost, it could never be reclaimed. And so the texts endured, changed, evolved, but never disappeared. By the medieval period, the Toledot Yeshu existed in dozens of versions across different languages: Aramaic, Hebrew, Yiddish, Arabic. Each community added its own details, its own interpretations. Some versions were more hostile than others. Some softened the accusations, but the core remained the same. This was a man, not a god. And his story had been rewritten by those who came after him. In 1405, a Spanish rabbi named Profiat Duran wrote a polemic text called "Be Not Like Your Fathers." In it, he referenced the Toledot Yeshu and argued that Christians had built their entire religion on a foundation of lies. He was forced to convert under threat of death. His books were burned, but copies survived, hidden in monasteries, passed between converts who secretly remained Jewish, kept alive by those who refused to forget. The question is not whether these texts are real. They are. Scholars have known about them for centuries. The question is whether they are true, and that is where the ground shifts beneath your feet. Because in 1859, something happened that changed everything. A German scholar named Johann Christoph Wagenseil published a Latin translation of the Toledot Yeshu. For the first time, Christian academics could read the full text without needing to access forbidden Jewish manuscripts. And what they found shocked them. Not because it was obviously false, but because parts of it aligned with historical records that the church had never acknowledged. The name Pantera, for example, the Roman soldier allegedly named as Jesus' father in some versions of the Toledot. For centuries, this was dismissed as Jewish slander, a cruel rumor designed to undermine the virgin birth. But then, in 1859, a Roman tombstone was discovered in Germany. It belonged to a soldier named Tiberius Julius Abdes Pantera, a member of a Roman cohort stationed in Judea during the time of Jesus' birth. The name was real, the man was real, and he was in the right place at the right time. Coincidence? Perhaps, but it rattled the certainty of those who had dismissed the Toledot as pure fiction. Then there were the accusations of sorcery. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus is accused by the Pharisees of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, the prince of demons. He denies it, but the accusation itself is recorded, which means that even his followers acknowledged that some people believed his miracles were not divine, that they came from darker sources. The Talmud says the same thing. So do early Christian heretics like Celsus, a Greek philosopher who wrote in the 2nd century that Jesus was a magician who learned his tricks in Egypt. Celsus was a pagan. He had no connection to Jewish texts, and yet his account matches the Toledot almost exactly. How do two independent sources, separated by culture and religion, arrive at the same conclusion? Unless they were both drawing from something older, something closer to the events themselves. In the Gospel of Matthew, there is a strange and often overlooked detail. After Jesus is arrested, the chief priests and Pharisees go to Pilate and say, "We remember that this impostor said, while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people, 'He has risen from the dead.'" This is canon, written in the Bible itself. The Jewish authorities explicitly predict that the disciples will steal the body and fake a resurrection. And according to the Gospel of Matthew, they were so concerned about this that they posted guards at the tomb. Now ask yourself, why would they predict that unless it was something they had seen before? Unless fake resurrections were a known tactic among messianic movements? The Toledot Yeshu claims that is exactly what happened, that the body was taken, that the resurrection was staged, and that the disciples knew it. And here is the part that will disturb you most. In 1945, a collection of early Christian texts was discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Among them was the Gospel of Judas, a Gnostic text that portrays Judas not as a betrayer, but as the only disciple who truly understood Jesus' mission. In this version, Jesus asks Judas to hand him over to the authorities, not as an act of treachery but as part of the plan. The Gospel of Judas was denounced as heresy, but it raises an uncomfortable question. If there were multiple versions of the Jesus story circulating in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and if the Church spent centuries suppressing the ones that didn't fit their narrative, how many other truths were erased? The Jewish texts were not the only ones that contradicted the Gospel. There were Christian texts too, dozens of them. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, all written by early followers of Jesus, all suppressed, all declared non-canonical by a church that needed one story, one truth, one version that could be controlled. And so the question remains, not whether the Toledot Yeshu is anti-Christian propaganda, it probably is, but whether it preserves fragments of a history that the church could not afford to let survive. Because if Jesus was a man, a rabbi, a radical who challenged Rome and Jerusalem alike, then his story is not one of divine sacrifice, it is one of political execution. And the religion built in his name is not the fulfillment of prophecy, it is the greatest rebranding in human history. The gods didn't erase this story because it was false, they erased it because it was dangerous. And now that you've heard it, you cannot unhear it. If you want to know what else they've been hiding, follow us into the dark.